Welcome no matter what you do not believe. Welcome no matter what you have done, and welcome no matter what you have left undone. Welcome no matter who you are, and of course, welcome no matter who you love, because this is not just our church here at Trinity-St. Paul's Centre for Faith, Justice and the Arts, and neither is it only the Church of the United Church of Canada. This is in fact the Church of Christ, and in Christ's Church, everyone is welcome. Welcome to all those, of course, who are worshiping with us on Zoom, and our opening hymn comes up. Let it rip. I'd invite you to pray with me. Let us pray. Dearest God, source of all love, the one, the Creator, the one who knows us better than we know ourselves, the one who's closer than our own breath, the one who gathers us, strengthens us, sends us forth, the one who reveals, is revealed, and always revealing, that one. We ask that you be with us in our worship today, that you inspire us, and that you open our eyes perhaps to a new way of thinking. We ask that you make the presence of Christ felt for us, and we ask all of this in Christ's name. Amen. Christ, candle, the light of our world. Just a couple of announcements today. We're delighted today to have our guest speaker. This is the last of the anti-racism series, and you'll hear more about her in a few minutes, and that is Krystin Wong-Tam, councillor in Toronto, of course. So please stay tuned and invite all those who aren't yet with us to come with us and listen to it. Next week, we have our Holy Land service. This happens once a year at Trinity-St. Paul's, and this year we are totally gifted with the presence of Seville and Sharon Leslie. Also with our joint churches on this venture, Bloor Street, Bathurst, and of course ourselves, Trinity-St. Paul's. So do come back next week for that. We always acknowledge that we are on traditional territory here, that this land has been sacred for thousands of years, and this week is no different. This week, of course, we think for those at Grassy Narrows. We think for those who are suffering from COVID. Last I heard, 50% had tested positive in Bearskin Lake. We think of the Wet'suwet'en out on the west coast and the fight for old-growth forests and their indigenous land rights as we listen to these words and respond. As we assemble in this holy place, we recognize that for thousands of years, this territory has been a sacred gathering place for many peoples of Turtle Island. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of several Indigenous nations and wish to pay special recognition to the Mississaugas of the Credit. The original nations continue to cry out for justice. And together we say, as treaty people, we commit to listen, learn, and work to right the wrongs of the past and present. And now we get to have some fun, and that is passing of the peace. It's an ancient Christian tradition, so for thousands of years Christians have been doing this around the world, and it's a sign that we do not walk the spiritual path alone, but that we always do it in community. Now you at home are free to hug and kiss and dance with each other, and if you're not at home, you can signal that you are passing the peace by putting yourself in the gallery mode on Zoom, and you can do this, you can do that, you can do this, you can do this, whatever moves you. And I started all off by saying, the peace of Christ be with you.
Our first reading is from Psalm 19, which we take from Voices United. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the vault of the sky reveals God's handiwork. One day speaks to another, and night shares its knowledge with night, and this without speech or language. Their voices are not heard, but their sound goes out to all the lands, their words to the ends of the earth. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from under the canopy, like an athlete eager to run the race. Its rising is at one end of the sky. It runs its course to the other, and there is nothing that is hidden from its heat. God's law is perfect, refreshing the soul. God's instruction is sure, giving wisdom to the simple. God's precepts are right, rejoicing the heart. God's commandment is pure, giving light to the eyes. God's fear is clean, enduring forever. God's judgments are true, every one of them righteous. More desirable than gold, even much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey, pure honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned, for in keeping them there is great reward. But who can discern unwitting sins? O cleanse me from my secret faults. Keep your servant also from presumptuous sins, lest they get the better of me. Then shall I be clean and innocent of great offense. Let the words of my mouth and the thoughts of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O God, my strength and my Redeemer. And our gospel reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 4, verses 14 to 21. Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread throughout all the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Amen.
I just want to say a few words about Doris Fulton, who will introduce our guest speaker today. First of all, for those of you who don't know, our Anti-Racist Committee has been hard at work for many, many months now, and it's resulted, among other things, in a series of wonderful speakers. We had John Sewell, we had Beverly Bain, and now we're having Krystin Wong-Tam. But Doris has been at the center of it all. No one has been more passionate about this work, more involved, and I just want to say kudos to you, Doris, and welcome to the podium to introduce Kristyn.
Thank you, Sherry, for your kind words. I appreciate that. So if you don't know by now, I'm Doris Fulton, and I want to wish everybody a good morning and a warm welcome to those of us who are joining us on Zoom for the very first time. Welcome to TSP. Our anti-racism group has come to the end of our speaker series, as Sherry mentioned, and we hope that this has been an informative look at some of the key issues that our city faces. Before I introduce our final speaker, though, I have a few housekeeping details for you. This reflection is going to last roughly, when our speaker comes on, roughly around 20 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A session immediately at the end of the service. So please stay for that, and please put your questions in the chat box. Our anti-racism group will meet again on Monday, February the 7th at 7 p.m. We will be discussing what we learned during this speaker series. Everyone who watched the series in whole or in part is welcome to attend. Just reach out to me by email so that we can send you the coordinates for attending our meeting. And we will put, my email address will go into our chat box for those of you who'd like to copy that down. So this morning, we are delighted to have Councillor Krystin Wong-Tam with us today. Her topic is, what creates a sense of urgency at City Hall? How can churches make a difference? A little background on Kristyn. She was elected to Toronto City Council in 2010, and she has worked tirelessly on social planning programs, new affordable housing, innovative economic development, community arts projects, diverse family-friendly neighborhood planning, tenants' rights, affordable and decent standards of rental housing, preserving and protecting heritage buildings and historical landscapes, and the elimination of barriers faced by people with disabilities. And she is currently chair of the Toronto Accessibility Advisory Committee. She's busy. So it's no surprise she was voted as Toronto's best city councillor by Now magazine 5 times. Kristyn was also supportive of the city's motion to defund the police by 10% last year, of keen interest to us here at TSP. In a long conversation I had with her this summer, I can tell you that she is compassionate, supportive, generous, and driven to make a difference. As Torontonians, she makes us all proud. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Councillor Krystin Wong-Tam.
Thank you very much, Doris, for that extremely generous introduction. And it's great to connect with all of you here. Sherry, I wish that we were obviously together in one place. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. We did do an audio check at the beginning, and I'm seeing some nods, so that's wonderful, so thank you. I just want to recognize that today is a very special day, largely because we're gathered here and we're spending some time together, but also we're marking, as we approach the 2 years of being in this new state of normal. And like all of you, I'm sure it's taken its toll. I have a 2.5-year-old son, and for 2 years of his life, just about, he's known lockdown. So his best friends are me and his other mother. And I really am desperately hoping that 2022 will be a much brighter and healthier year for all. I know that, Courtney, if I can ask you to just put the slides on the screen, we'll begin the presentation. And folks, I prepared a small slide presentation for you just to sort of, I believe in the use of visual tools wherever we can. It really pokes at our memory. It also, stirs the emotion, which I think is really important, because we can't just obviously act with only our head, but also our heart. And today I'd like to also, at the Q&A portion, hear from you when you speak from your heart. Courtney, can you let me know if the screen is, if we have it? Okay, fantastic, thank you. If we can just adjust that so it sits properly on the view. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so I was really struggling to figure out what to call this presentation. And to be quite honest, I was struggling because largely, how do I capture into words so much that needs to be done in terms of social justice, how to bring together a conversation about the role that faith has in the city and in particular churches, and how do you connect that and weave it into government action. And so I kind of broke it down, and to be quite honest, it was a 20-minute exercise on my part. So I just came up with Justice Matters. And I have to say, I didn't come up with it on my own, and I'll share with you where it did come from. But it really, I think, captured what I'd like to speak about. Next slide, please. So I'm going to begin by saying, and I think we need to understand a foundation of truth. Historically, Canadians have always considered themselves to be, more or less free of racial prejudice. And although this concept has been challenged over the recent years, it still has not been completely dispelled. And as someone who is coming to Canada as an immigrant, my family and I immigrated in the 1970s. English is actually not my first language. I wanted to build a life. My parents really wanted us to build a life, but I've really learned to love this country. And as part of why I love it so much is why I'm actually involved with the work that I do. But I wanted to just acknowledge that not every single one of us came to Canada as a free person, nor were we all welcome. Next slide, thank you. So the next image you're going to see is one that you've probably seen before. It's very topical these days, and because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, more people are more aware now than ever before about the hardships and unjust treatment that was subjected to Canada's Indigenous people. Unspeakable treatment. Over 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children were snatched from their families, removed from their culture, their language, and their communities, and dropped into isolation. They were faced with abuse and denigration, and those traumas experienced by those families continue to this day. And I don't need to share with you the history that the churches had in terms of their leadership in these programs. Next slide. But it doesn't just go from there. It keeps happening. So the next few slides I'm going to share with you, I just want to ground everybody. I'm going to talk about, at this point in time, the history of racism in Canada. The image that you're seeing in front of you is from Haro, Nova Scotia. And between 1628 and 1800s, about 3,000 African people of African ancestry were enslaved in the US and then brought to Canada, and then they were forced to live in slavery here. And slavery, of course, is one of Canada's best kept secrets. Unlike the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there hasn't been an equivalent where we've brought to light that particular form of oppression and segregation and control. Canada obviously is known for its participation and connection to the Underground Railroad, but it's certainly not the only thing that we have that should connect us to slavery. And post-Confederation, there were two provinces that had legislated separated schools. So this is where schools for whites and schools for non-whites. And these two provinces were Nova Scotia and Ontario. The last segregated school in Ontario did not close until 1964. And that was in Nova Scotia. Next slide, please. When Canada opened its doors for immigration, I wanted to just point out a couple of things. Immigration, Canada has always put itself out as a country that welcomes all, but it doesn't, as we already know. It opened its doors wide to settlers from the United Kingdom into Western Europe, but it was not so welcoming to other groups. 17,000 Chinese laborers came to Canada to help build the Canadian Pacific Railroad. Many will recognize that because of the railroad, that led to the formation of Canada. Without the Chinese laborers, without the railroad, there would not have been the linking of this country with a ribbon of steel from coast to coast, and there would have been no Canada, not in the way that we know it. After the laborers' work was completed, Canada then introduced a series of head tax that only ever applied to one ethnic group ever in its history, and that was the Chinese immigrants. And following that, when it didn't slow down the flow of immigration of the Chinese and the quote unquote the Orientals, Canada then decided to literally shut its doors, immigration doors, by creating the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1923 to 1947. Families were separated and literally torn apart. Again, there's intergenerational trauma from that. Next slide. And as Canada continued to welcome its British subjects, there were those who were not so fortunate. Many of you will recognize the Komagatu Maru. In 1914, this ship which had about 376 people who were of the Sikh, Hindu, Muslim faith. They were not permitted to land in Vancouver. The ship was then returned to India, where 19 men were shot and many more were imprisoned. People choose to come to this country because they're trying to flee from persecution, from war, from famine, for a better life. We have a tragic history of shutting our borders when people need us the most. Next slide, please. We also know that, the discrimination wasn't just necessarily for only racialized people. And in 1939, Canada turned away MS St. Louis, an ocean liner carrying 908 Jewish refugees. They were forced back to Europe, where a quarter of them then were killed in the Holocaust. Next slide. During the Second World War, the Canadian government forced about 20,000 Japanese Canadians, over 75% of them who were Canadians, 25% who had not received their status as Canadians as of yet. They put them into internment camps. They confiscated their businesses, their boats, and when the war ended, 4,000 people were then deported back to Japan. Interestingly enough, there's really no Japantown across Canada. And I think that the shame that was embedded in the community is so deep that from coast to coast, although there were Japanese Canadians, and primarily many of them in the west coast of this Canada, they've never been able to sort of reclaim that physical geographical space as a neighborhood. Next slide. So after World War II, Canada continued to exclude certain types of immigrants. And the list of those who were welcomed into the country included those, again, from the United Kingdom, from Western Europe. And it largely excluded people from Asia, from Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean. And it wasn't until the late 70s when Prime Minister Trudeau decided to change all that. And that's when my family came to the country. And of course, next slide, the issues around racial equality continue today. COVID pandemic has certainly exacerbated many of the social and health inequities. But as someone who is of Chinese descent, this has been a particularly difficult 2 years as we have struggled as a community with the extraordinary rise of anti-Asian hate. And as you can tell, this is something that's probably not going to go away. If you've ever Googled anti-Asian racism on the internet, you'd be surprised by what you see and how much you see. It literally is another plague that is circling around the globe. I'm now going to speed things up and bring us back into contemporary days. Next slide, please. George Perry Floyd Jr., born in 1973 and killed in 2020, murdered by a Minneapolis police officer. This officer put his knees and constrained George by his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. 4 officers were arrested. The scene was recorded. The entire tragedy was then broadcast through social media streaming. And what happened afterwards set off a new global movement to denounce anti-Black racism, colonialism. And I think that that's where I'd like to take us now, because this is what we're going to be dealing with at City Council, even though the death took place in 2020. But it's becoming harder and harder to see the results. And I'm going to share with you why. Next slide. So the title of my presentation came from this mask. I was Googling George Floyd. I was trying to do some background research as I was getting ready for our presentation today. And I just thought, this really captured everything that I wanted to connect with and talk about. So my presentation title is actually inspired from the creator of this mask. Next slide. So after Mr. Floyd was murdered by the police and it was broadcast around the world, what we saw was a guttural uprising of people who were just inflamed, literally inflamed by what they saw. And you have to, and I know you remember because you were all there, we were under a early lockdown. We didn't know what the coronavirus was. There was still much that we were trying to understand, but people didn't care. Their guttural reaction was there was an injustice. We all were horrified to witness the murder, and the rage compelled them to action, and that action forced them to take to the streets. There was $55 million worth of damage that the city of Minneapolis is still trying to recapture, but I think that's a small price to pay compared to what had happened to the Floyd family and to the many people who have suffered from the hands of state oppression. Next slide. This is another image of a police station, of course, you saw earlier, but also businesses that were laid to bear. They were literally set on fire. This is the third night of protests in Minneapolis. Even the store owners, I was actually quite taken back by even the store owners that were watching their businesses burn, understood the anger of the protesters. They sympathized with people that were torching their neighborhood because they needed to release their anger and grief. Next slide. The world woke up. We started to see presentations and demonstrations. People were leaving their quarantine apartments and homes and meeting each other on the streets. Next slide. The common theme and cry around the world, and it happened from Berlin to Wales to Australia, to places that had never seen even protests, I would imagine, of this magnitude with this type of unified message, is to stop police violence. And people were demanding for a rethinking of what community safety and public health needed to look like. Next slide. It didn't stop there. It literally took over places of government. And it shut down cities. Downtown cities were shut down as people came to the street. What was remarkable about these presentations is that they were really, for me, as I observed them, interracial, intergenerational, and coalition building. People who were involved with different social justice movements started to coalesce together and demand once again that another world is possible. Next slide. We also started to hear immediately the call to defund the police. And that was a bit of a galvanizing call because I think there were some individuals and thought leaders and community advocates who've been asking for this type of thinking for a number of years. But the mainstream then got behind it. And that was really where I believe things started to shift. Next slide. The call to defund got louder and louder and louder. In my office at City Hall, I received 30,000 unique emails and phone calls about this issue. No other issue in my 11 years at City Council has ever garnered that much communication, and that was just to me. Now, you can imagine what the mayor's office would have received, although he never came public with how much attention his office would have received by way of the communication. But in my experience, it was the #1 issue that I had ever faced as an elected official. Next slide, please. You're going to see more images, and I wanted to just show you a few more because it really showed you how people were refusing to go until somebody said, let's do something about it inside the House of Government. And these protesters and these advocates, these individuals who weren't even, what also surprised me, well, actually it wasn't surprising, but what I was gripped by was that many people said it was their very first protest. They hadn't, but what they saw on the screen, what they saw in that 9-minute, 29-second video just they couldn't stop. Next slide, please. And this continued around the world. We also saw police officers, next slide, start to take a knee and connect with protesters across, in this case, a bicycle line, but sometimes security fences. Even officers on the other side of the fence recognized what happened was outrageous and that the people had a right to express their anger and their grief and their sorrow. Next slide. And of course, Toronto was not immune from any of this. Toronto was also the place of protests. I live downtown Toronto, so I saw it from my window. I saw it from the street. I was able to join them. Again, the protest was led by young Black men and women. And one of the important changes, as I've noted, is that they were unified in a way that I had not seen, especially when it came from the suburban and the urban, which is something else that I wanted to speak about that doesn't always happen in the amalgamated city. We also saw people rise up for Regis Parquet, and it was led by a new group of advocates, not just BLM or Black Lives Matter, but not another Black life. And so there's starting to be a bit of a splintering of organizations, but the message remained the same. Next slide. And we saw them at Bay and Yonge. We saw them at Yonge and Dundas. Next slide. And that's just right outside the police headquarters. Next slide, please. And thank you. And next slide. And in the city of Toronto, we started to see police officers take a knee. I think the question might have to be, how sincere were them when they took the knee in that moment? Were they compelled into action or reaction or as a response to the protest? And were they deeply committed to the institutional structural reform that people were asking for? That has yet to be seen, although I'll give you a hint on where I think it's going. Next slide. We saw the police chief at the busiest intersection of the country take a knee with the protesters, bowing their head in solemn respect and solidarity, fists in the air, pledging to do more, pledging to make change. Next slide. This was right outside my doorstep. Defund the Police was painted right onto College Police Headquarters on College Street, and that message stayed there for several weeks. It's gone now, but it was a very powerful message which City Council could not ignore. So next slide. In 2020, all of that took place. And the motion that I moved forward with Councillor Matlow was to call for a defunding of the police by a minimum of 10%. And we were criticized, and as well as we were lauded, but criticized by some who said we didn't go far enough, that we needed to defund the police by 100%. Others said 50%, others said 30%. And so there was that scale and range. And then there was also criticism about how dare you, how dare I, how dare City Council debate this issue when the police are doing such a good job, such a difficult job. And as you can tell, those same opinions would exist today. It was important for me as an elected official to lean into what I was hearing at that time. And it's not necessarily something that was new, because I have heard communities, because I represent Regent Park in St. Jamestown, where we have a lot of policing. I also represent Canada's largest, most dynamic gay village, where we have a complicated relationship with the police. Some of it good, a history of really horrible police abuse and actions, and then some of it bad. But it really depends on almost who you are in our community, and that would almost dictate the type of relationship you have with the police. And so therefore, if you're a racialized trans individual, you may not have the same type of friendly relationship with the police if you were a white property owner. So I worked with Councillor Matlow to advance that motion because we felt that it was our responsibility to take the voices of the community that was out on the street, to bring them into City Council, to give it political action. Because at some point in time, we need to make some decisions. So in the middle of the biggest historical global pandemic, the #1 issue that council had to deal with in 2022 was anti-Black racism. Next slide. So this is what happened in June 2020. City Council adopted 36 motions related to policing reform. I advanced a number of them. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. August following, the Toronto Police Board also then released a report that said that they were going to move towards reforming their own service with 81 recommendations. And all of that is now work that's percolating about. Next slide. I'm going to speak a little bit more in detail about this. The Community Crisis and Support Pilot Project, which is what we would call the alternative to policing, took place after long consultation with community members. There were roundtables, meetings with subject matter experts, and individual surveys and dialogues. It took 2 years to develop this program from the time of the debate to now. And this is one of the things that did get successfully adopted. The 10% reduction did not, just so everyone is aware, and I think you know. But this program, the pilot project, is going to be launched, is going to be debated, I should say, this coming Wednesday at the Executive Committee, which is the committee of the chair and the chair's committee lead. So every standing committee has a chair. All those mayoral allies will be meeting on Wednesday to deliberate over this program. This program has 4 different pieces to it, and this is the police diversion piece. We will see a Northwest program, a Northeast program, a Downtown East program, which is what I represent, and a Downtown West program, which is where your community is. And the agency leads are as follow. Kristyn Crisis Center is managing the Downtown East, and the Two Spirited People, the First Nations agency, is managing the Downtown West. All of this is going to be a pilot project. They hope to engage with the community robustly, but as every other pilot project, I will probably tell you right now that I believe it's underfunded and understaffed, which could also lead it to be not as successful with its outcome as we would like it. Next slide, please. So just to show you a map of where the service is going, that dark blue one, Ward 13, that's me, that's my community. You are the lighter blue portion to the left of the screen, and it sort of borders between Ward 11 and the majority of Ward 10. And that's going to be managed by the 2 people of the First Nations. And then you've got the Northeast and Northwest component, but you'll see that the gray area of the city is under-resourced and under-staffed. So they do not have a pilot project. They will only have the 911 policing calls. Next slide, please. So this is when it begins. I'm just going to focus us on the Downtown West and the Downtown East, and you'll see the initials DTW and DTE. My program on the Downtown East will begin on March the 22nd. Your program on the Downtown West will begin in June 2022, sorry, March 2022 and June 2022. So it's all coming rapidly. I know that Gerstein Center is hiring right now for the Downtown East program, and the same thing is going to be happening for Two Spirited of the First Nations people. And it'll be locally integrated with a number of different health providers. So the agencies that you see on the screen with their logos are the lead coordinating agents, but they're not the ultimate service provider for every single component of service needed. They'll be working in teams, and everyone is working from a place of harm reduction as a centering piece, but also doing anti-oppression, anti-racist work. And that's how they're going to be approaching those who are experiencing crisis. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's figure out how much is this going to cost. So the 4 pilot projects that I've just shared with you is valued at about $8.5 million. That's the total cost of the 4 pilot projects, and it covers those 4 areas on the map. Now, the Toronto police budget going to the city for debate in February, we're going to be adopting the global City Toronto budget, is $1.2 billion. So the police are asking for an increase of 2.3 to bring them to $1.26 billion. And of course, at the same time, 2 years ago, we asked them to defund, but we weren't successful in that vote. The cost of the $8.5 million for the community crisis pilot projects, including the increase to the SDFA total, I should have mentioned that, is almost just under $11 million. But the SDFA total, what I want to point to your attention is that it's all internal city staff funding. So we're basically adding 6 new staff persons to the city divisions, but they're not necessarily going to be frontline staff. But when it comes to what the program is going to really be valued at, the number is in front of you. And that is coming out of the city's operating budget. So it's not coming from the Toronto police budget, but rather the city's budget. Next slide. So how does this program work? You would call 911. The 911 call will then determine whether or not it's a non-violent call. If it is a suicide call, if it requires a special type of attention and report, and if they deem that the call can be forwarded to 211, which is the community service line, they're going to basically redirect those crisis calls to 211. And then from 211, they're going to do a quick assessment on the phone to make sure that they fully understand the caller's needs. And then they will mobilize the crisis teams. Those crisis teams will then go out to meet that person to provide assistance. So they're going to be traveling in vehicles. It doesn't have to be obviously an ambulance or not paramedics. They will be driving or walking to those calls. They arrive on the scene. They're available 24/7. They provide individual care, and they try to connect them with service. All of this within 48 hours, and that's where the diversion comes in. The intention is that, there are many things that the police will do that they're probably very good at, that they're trained to do. But when a police officer shows up, traditionally they're trained with, they arrive with their guns, their vests, what seems to be, real heavy duty, sort of action oriented appearance. And that could be entirely intimidating in the wrong response. And we train police officers to do their job in that way. They're not trained in the same way on de-escalation, mental health supports, dealing with someone with psychosis. Although they have been assigned that work for years, they have not been trained adequately for that work. And that's what the crisis diversion program is about. Next slide. We're going to be evaluating this through a number of lenses. And the evaluation process is important because it also determines whether or not we get to scale it up and cover those gray areas on the map. So therefore, we bring out more workers and we make it a citywide program as opposed to four patches of the city on the map. We have to determine its service effectiveness. We have to determine the quality of service. Are we intending to get to where we want to go? There should be an evaluation on finance. So therefore, does this actually save the city money? And if it does, are we still getting comparable or even better results? And then we need to understand what should we do for the budget in 2023 and whether or not the four pilot projects will scale up. One of the biggest challenges that I see when it comes to mental health and crisis support is that it's woefully under-resourced and also uncoordinated. So we have different organizations working in different silos and not necessarily working together. And the type of collaboration that I anticipate through the crisis programs is going to be historic. I don't think we've ever, I know we haven't seen this level of system and service coordination from these organizations before. And that is truly exciting work. Next slide. There were also 81 recommendations I mentioned from the police the police debate. The police, this is the police's information, so I can't tell you if it's absolutely true or not, but I'm just sharing it with you, so I want you to have it. 51% of those recommendations have been implemented or quote unquote addressed. This was all adopted by their board. So their board, the Toronto Police Service Board, is satisfied with their work. But this presentation is going to City Council just now on Wednesday. 25 of them are still being worked through, and then 5 of them are more longer term recommendations. There's going to be a fuller report at the end of this year. So what I've given you right now as a pie graph is simply a snapshot, and you'll get the full report when we get it at City Council. Next slide, please. I'm going to offer you this. We have about 36 actions that City Council adopted that we wanted to particularly have in place. 30 of those, according to staff, are now implemented. Some of the things that are absolutely critical, and I'm very proud of the work, is that by way of even having that debate, we were, for the very first time, able to get the police chief agree to providing City Council a line-by-line budget review. Can you imagine? Every year we're asked to approve $1 billion worth of spending, and we've never been able to see the budget until now. This is the very first time. We also are getting a new accountability office for the Toronto Police. So the Auditor General of the City of Toronto has now been given purview over looking over the police finances as well, which I think is critically important because she works for the city, not for the Toronto Police. The other accountability office that has extended itself to take a look at police operations, and this is from a policy review, is the Ombudsman's office at the City of Toronto, which is known as the Office of Last Resort, which means that if you cannot get service or you feel like you've been discriminated or treated unfairly, then your last resort through the lack of action or the lack of satisfactory action through the Toronto Public Service is to go to the Ombudsman. We've never had that type of control or policy review over police operations. So some of the more controversial policies that the police has had, for example, is race-based data collection as well as carding. The Ombudsman never had a say over how that worked. Even City Council didn't have a say over how that worked, and now we will. So we'll be seeing a year-end review as it comes up. And I wanted to just share with you that a lot of this information is on my website. And the next slide will give you that link. It's KrystinWongTam.ca/policing budget. As you can tell, I'm pretty energized about this issue to even have a dedicated microsite on my main site. I really support and believe in the actions of trying to rebalance the police budget. There are so many different pressing needs at the City of Toronto, and I want to make sure that we get to all the residents in ways that they need to have their city respond and support them. Next slide. I still believe that the City of Toronto is one of the best places in the world to live, invest, to study, and to play. Toronto was really my first love. And I never thought I'd grow as attached to this city as I do. It is also a beautiful social democratic experiment that we get to continue to push forward. And I know that's one of the reasons why this committee at the church exists, is because you believe in those same things as well. I told you that I'm a parent, so I wanted to share you this slide. This is the next one. You know, why are we doing all this work? Social justice work is hard. There's no reward for it except for the work itself and the connections that we make. But I want to make sure that my son inherits a better world than I leave it. And I want to make sure that, you know, he's not going to be judged by his skin color or by he has a developmental disability. So I don't want him to be judged on that. I want him to be judged and known and loved for who he is. And that's something that I work really hard at, and I know you do as well. And that's what motivates me. Next slide. I wanted to just kind of end on this second last slide here. This is the title of the book of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, he needs no introduction. We all know who he is. But I couldn't help but really ask myself, and I ask myself this all the time, especially after a big world event. I always ask myself, where do we go from here? Because we have seen, you know, Occupy Wall Street. That came and went. The banks got bigger than ever before. You know, predatory capitalism is still here. And there was this surge and uprise when people started to lose their homes. That they wanted to go and take over financial services and reform the financial system. We didn't do it. We also saw, you know, recently the uprise of women as we were, you know, asking for a life that was free from sexual violence, sexual harassment, and discrimination. And so we saw the rise of a new women's movement that was intergenerational, interracial, and, you know, the Women's March, very similar to Black Lives Matter and to the Defund police, took major cities, occupied their downtowns, and everyone was wearing a pink hat. And I think to myself, where have we gone from there? Have we seen a decline of sexual harassment, sexual predatory behavior? Have we eliminated and removed misogyny and patriarchy from the world? Or are we still living under those systems? And sadly, I think we are. I know we are. So the question here for the defund movement, and for those who are very interested in rebalancing the police budget and also reforming police services, which I think is the most important thing, is where do we go from here? And this is where I'm going to ask you to, because I know there was a request to sort of let you know what you can do. And I'm going to speak very honestly about this because I think you need to hear it from me. After the protests, as we've seen with all the protests, people went home. And the 2020 June debate, you know the story and the outcome. I lost. That motion to defund by 10% was lost. But other things were gained, such as the items that I've just spoken about. The fact that we got the line-by-line budget review, we have new accountability measures, and the crisis pilot projects that I've just described to you. So there was a significant loss that we couldn't eliminate 10% of the police budget, but there were also significant gains. But it's been quiet, eerily quiet from the public since that debate, because August, we saw another debate at City Council, August 2021. And this is where those June 2020 reports came back to council. And it was a very different type of debate at council. It wasn't electric hot. I didn't receive 30,000 new notices from community members asking me to continue to push for police reform. It was almost quiet. You can hear a pin drop. So the question here is that if we want to see true equality and we want to see true policing reforms and we want to eradicate poverty and racism and all the things that hold us back, that keep us separate, then we're going to need to organize and get louder once again. And I need everyone to come through the political channels, because that's where some of that change is going to take place. And that's what I really want us to be aware of, is that the energy of 2020 is gone. And I'm really glad that you are still here and still talking and pushing about it, about these issues, which I know you care so deeply about. But many of those advocates have not resurfaced at City Council in ways that I need them to. And council wins votes when there's 14 of us out of 27 that supports the motions. And on good days, we have 8. So it's hard work, and we can't do it without you. Final slide, please. And I say we do this by only lifting each other, one another. Thank you.